Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Adult Bible Fellowship. I don't know if that works or not, but I'll work on a better intro. Yeah, thanks, Carol. I got one fan on the screen there. That's wonderful. So glad to have all of you here with us. We are starting a new study, and for reals, we're starting a new study, and the study is called How the Story Ends. And for those of you that are... I'm kind of stuck on this story thing, right? Like, I seem like all I do is talk about story. I think, though, what you'll discover is that for me, story is the very best theme or whatever by which to see the whole Bible. I think if we understand the Bible through the context of story, so much of it will make sense when we really struggle sometimes to understand all the details of the Bible. Like, if you just see the Bible as like an encyclopedia of facts that are all kind of jumbled and thrown together, because that's sort of the way the Bible is presented to us, right? We get one book and then another book, and they don't necessarily have anything to do with one another on first glance. It's the story, for me, that kind of pulls the Bible together and connects it as this one single document. So story is really, really important. And yes, we are talking about the end times, but I want to be careful to put that end times within the context of the story itself. If we miss out on the story, or, as I've said here, this first section I'm calling skipping to the end, right? Skipping to the end. If we choose to skip to the end of the story, there's some disadvantages, big time, to just skipping to the end and pretending like these events that we're going to talk about are disconnected from everything that's come before. Now, I don't want to ruin my own thunder here, so I'm not going to go any further with that thought at the moment. But where we started last week was just talking in general about stories in general. Because even if you feel intimidated by the Bible, which a lot of us do, because not all of us grew up having it taught to us from the time we were infants, little children on our parents' knees. If you're intimidated by the Bible, I can tell you this much. You understand how story works. You just do, okay? Your brains have been wired to understand stories from the time you were a little kid. And if you can grapple with the story concepts from those worlds and kind of bring it into the study of the Bible, you're going to be light years ahead of where you think you are. In fact, you may not be that far behind those people that spent their whole lives in church and hearing the stories and all that good stuff, okay? So we talked last week about the concept in stories about skipping to the end of the story. What are the downsides, right, of just deciding, okay, here's a novel, right, by Charles Dickens. I just finished A Tale of Two Cities this week, which, by the way, is an amazing book. This Charles Dickens guy, I think he's going somewhere. Like, I think he might have some talent. I'm not sure, but I think he's pretty gifted. Anyway, I just finished Tale of Two Cities this week, and the ending is just a blockbuster. I can't believe there's not a legit movie out of The Tale of Two Cities, because the story is so compelling. The last 50 pages are a screamer from the first page down to the end. And to the very end is this dramatic ending. It's very moving. It's very suspenseful. I mean, it's got everything you want in a story, right? But if you start reading the story on page 310, and you just read the last 50 pages, because that's where all the good stuff is, right? All the action and the adventure and all the resolution to all the conflict happens in that last 50 pages. There are some severe disadvantages to you reading A Tale of Two Cities, right? And a couple of them are fairly obvious, and we talked about them last week. Some of those disadvantages are we don't know who the characters are. Who are the characters? If you just skip to the end and you read the end, you have no idea who these people are. You have no idea what is driving these characters. You have no idea how the characters have changed from the beginning to the end. My favorite character in A Tale of Two Cities starts off as a despicable human being in the first few chapters. And you're like, why is this guy even in the story? He's such a jerk. I hate him. And then by the end, you love him because the change from chapters 1, 2, and 3 through the end, right, is so remarkable that it makes the end that much more valuable to have been there at the beginning to see how he used to be, right? So we don't know who the characters are, which also means we don't know who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. There's a lot of exciting action and a lot of things are happening, but you have no context, right? That's another disadvantage. There's no context. There's no context. There's no way for you to interpret if what's happening is good or bad, right? Oh yeah, lots of stuff. Buildings are blowing up. Okay, but is it a good blowing up or is it a bad blowing up? If you haven't been through the first part of the story, even slogging through the difficult parts in the middle to get to the end, then all of a sudden all the action has no context, okay? There's just no sense of whether or not what's happening is good or bad or happy or sad. You sort of just are stumbling your way through. You're lost, right? And you're I would also suggest another disadvantage is that you're confused. And of course, I didn't leave myself enough room. Confused with the message, the point. Again, I'm sorry to go back to Tale of Two Cities, but that's the one that's been on my mind all week long. If you just read the end of the book, you might come to a very different conclusion about what Charles Dickens thinks about the French Revolution than what he actually thinks. If you haven't been through the first 250 pages as he sort of lays out his ideas about what this story is trying to tell, you could come to the end, read the ending, and think that he sympathizes with a group of people that in the context of the whole book, he really doesn't sympathize with. And so you might come to the end going, wow, this group of people are great. And that's not his point at all. And if you skip the first 75, 80% of the story to get to the end where all the good stuff happens, interesting stuff happens, then you're going to miss his point. And poor Mr. Dickens worked really, really hard, right, to communicate his point throughout this entire book. And it's funny because I'm not going to get into a review of Tale of Two Cities any more than I already have. I'm sorry. I'm just so tempted because who am I going to talk to about this? My poor wife gets tired of she hasn't read it yet, so she doesn't want me to tell her all the stuff in it because then so who am I going to spoil it for? Although if you're mad about it being a 200-year-old book being spoiled for you, I don't know what I can tell you. It's not my fault. It's not my fault, Trish, that you haven't read Tale of Two Cities, okay? I'm just joking with you, Trish. I love you. Okay, I'll keep moving. She's smiling at me. Okay, it's all right. I didn't offend her, I don't think, to start off the day. That's good. Good. She's shaking her head for those of you on the live stream. Okay, I'm still getting used to this whole Zoom thing, as you can tell. So anyway, that's the point I'm trying to make. So we have to be careful when it comes to the Bible that we don't just jump to the book of Revelation, because that's the book that's got all of the weird stuff happening in it, and millions of people are dying, and pestilence, and there's an antichrist, and there's a beast, and there's a dragon, and there's all this exciting stuff. It's just a mistake to just skip to the end, catch the end of the story, because here's the thing. Yes, you will be able to understand some of the broad picture about what's happening, but if you have not been paying attention to the beginning or to the middle of the biblical story and you jump to the end of it, it's not going to make sense. There are people who think that God is this bloodthirsty God who all he wants to do is destroy humanity any chance he gets because they selectively read portions of the story. They read the portions of the story where God judges sinful humanity, whether it's in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. They single out those individual passages and they go, isn't God horrible? Isn't God bloodthirsty? Isn't God violent? Isn't God, fill in the blank, whatever thing offends our sensibilities today. And what I would beg those people to do is read the judgment in the context around it, okay? The story tells us something about God. And then we come to the judgment portions. We come to Revelation, where a lot of the loose ends of the story get tied up. Not all of them, but a lot of the loose ends get tied up. And if you don't understand the story, the loose ends getting tied up will only confuse you, and you'll come away with the wrong perspective on God himself and what he's like and what he's all about, what matters to him, how he wants to handle things, if you just skip straight to the end. Okay, so here's a point that I want to make here as we jump to the advantages, though, because this is important. there are significant disadvantages to just being a prophecy chart Christian. Okay? A prophecy chart, you know what I'm talking about? I remember back in the old days when I was a kid, we would have these prophecy conferences, okay? And they were great. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not criticizing. I'm not making fun. I don't do that. That's not how I roll. But these prophecy conferences sometimes, because again, even in the old days when they would get together like every night of the week for like a week, that's seven times you're together. And how could you possibly tell the story of the Bible in 7 times? It's just impossible. So what they would tend to do is they would focus in on everything from what Christians call the rapture, through what Christians call the tribulation, through to what the Christians call the second coming, through that to what the Christians call the millennium, and beyond the millennium to what the Christians call the eternal state. And we sort of hit that, and they were all beautifully illustrated on these beautiful charts that were, wow, they were eye-popping and mind-blowing and really awesome to look at. And I'm telling you what, there's little illustrations of little dragons and things happening all over the place. And as a kid, I was fascinated with all this stuff, right? But here's the problem. Most of these prophecy conferences did not have a lot of context. They didn't offer you a lot of the sense of, how did we get here? Okay, so if that's the way this Bible says the story is going to end, okay, and I'm not denying that, how do we get here, and why is it good that we get here? Like, why is the ending of the story necessary? Because there's a lot of bad stuff that happens, a lot of scary bad stuff that happens at the end. But the Bible writes the story in such a way so that you understand this is necessary. The ending is not just one of 14 different options God could have chosen, and he decided to go with the most violent one, right? This is the ending to the story that had to happen. It's necessary based on where the story has come so far. Now, as we go along over the next, 14 years, I'm going to do my best to try to explain the context for the end. Now, not because I'm reluctant to talk about the end stuff. We're going to get to the end stuff. I have no problem with that. We're going to talk about dragons, and we're going to talk about bowls of wrath, and we're going to talk about that stuff. However, it's really, really, really important that those of us jumping in at this point have some measure of context to understand who the characters are in this story, what the context of these events are so that we can figure out if they're good or bad, right? And then figure out what is the point of all this information, right? Because here's the thing. God could just let the end of the world happen, right? Without telling you anything about it, right? Does he owe you an explanation for how the story's going to end? Does he owe you a warning ahead of time so that you know how the story's going to end? Absolutely not. It is totally within his purview to decide. He has the right to decide, I'm just going to let the end of the world happen. I'm not going to warn him. I'm not going to tell him about it. I'm not going to let him prepare for it. It's just going to happen. He could do that. However, God in his wisdom has chosen to reveal some of what we want to know about the end. Okay? Because that's true, I think we owe it to God to understand the context for all that stuff before we get to this end times stuff. Because we need to understand who God is. That's the most important thing about all this, guys. The most important thing is not figuring out what is going to happen. It's not figuring out the events. That's not the most important part of the study. The most important part of the study is, who is the God we're dealing with? Who is he? What's he really like? What's going on inside of his heart? How do the events of the world's history show us who God is? If you remember, I don't know if you remember this or not. We'll probably get back to this a little bit later when we really tackle the book of Revelation. The very first verse of Revelation gives a title for the entire prophecy, the entire book. And it says, the revelation of, and you're like, ooh, of end time events, right? This book reveals what happens in the end. That's not what Revelation 1:1 says. Revelation 1:1 says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, who sent his messenger to tell what was going to happen. Okay? What is the point of Revelation, the book of Revelation, and in general, the revelation of God's word from start to finish? The most important thing that this book reveals is not what is going to happen or even what happened. That's important, but the most important thing that this book reveals to us is who God is. His nature, his character, what he's all about. Because here's the thing, even if you have no idea what's coming, and even if you have no idea what happened, you still today need to deal with this God revealed in this book. He is standing, not literally, but he's figuratively standing in your way saying, you have to deal with me. I exist. I'm the reason you exist, and you have to figure out how to relate to me. That means you need to know who I am, which means I'm going to leave you a revelation. And in the context, I'm not going to just tell you in a bullet point theological list all of my characteristics and attributes. Because God could have done that, right? He could have dropped a bullet pointed list, and most of us in America would be happy with that. Thank you, God, for giving me an orderly account of who you are in very logical fashion. And God says, no, we're going to do it a little different. I'm going to tell you a series of stories that are all connected together, and you are going to see who I am in the context of real people's lives. And you're going to have to wrestle through the messy parts of their lives, just like you have to wrestle through the messy part of your life. And you're going to see how I interacted with those people, because you need to know how to interact with me as you're going through your messy stuff. See what I'm saying? The Bible is a revelation of God. Yes, I believe 100% it tells us what happened, and it tells us what will happen. And I believe everything that it says about what happened, even if people want to make me feel like a fool because of it. And I believe everything that it says about what will happen, even if some people want to make me feel a fool for what I believe about that. But the most important part of Scripture is knowing God. Because if you know him, you'll be okay with the events in the future. If you know him, the events of the past will teach you the lessons they're supposed to teach you, if you know him. However, if you know the events that happened in the past, and if you know the events that are happening in the future, and you don't know God, you are, by definition, unprepared for those events in the future. Does that make sense? You sort of with me on that? I'm sorry if I'm beating this dead horse here, but it's really important that we understand this. The beginning of the story matters, and we sometimes agree with that because there's all that controversy around the beginning of the story. I'm going to tell you this too. The slower, messier middle of the story is also super important to understand before we talk about the end. Now, that's one of the reasons too why we are inordinately interested in the travails of the Israelite people, okay? Because on one level, right, it's kind of silly. They lived Abraham lived probably 3,500 years ago. No, Abraham probably lived 4,000 years ago, okay? And you go, how can the family history of this obscure little tribe in the middle of stinking nowhere, there's a desert, and they're there, right? How could their family history relate to my life so much so that I will stand up here 4,000 years later and talk about their story and draw lessons from it for my story? It seems ridiculous, right? But the Israeli people, these people that God, according to the story, that God chose out of the nations of the world as a way to reveal himself to the world and bring salvation to the world, their story is crucial. It is crucial. And if you don't understand the Israelite story, you will never understand your story. So that's my diatribe on that. Now let's move on, okay? So there are some disadvantages to skipping to the end. And just so you know, I'm about to sneeze at some point in the next 3 to 4 minutes. I don't know when it's going to happen. It's kind of like the return of Jesus. I don't know when it's going to happen. I just know it's going to happen. So please be prepared. Those of you on Zoom and on the live stream are safe. There's only a couple of people in this room. I'll try to stand far enough back. I've heard sometimes it can travel 26 feet. And knowing my lung capacity, my capacity for hot air, I'm positive that I can get that 26 feet. So just beware. I'll try to, do the thing. So, okay. Here's a cool thing, and this is where you want to pick up in your notes, okay? The notes, by the way, are updated with a font you can actually read. If you're interested in such things, on our website, fbchh.org, on the resources tab, all the way down halfway, you'll see ABF notes. If you want to even just click on that while I'm teaching, you'll be able to at least look and see what I have. If you're one of those people that likes to print them off and like write hand notes, you can do that. Totally up to you. Or you can just kind of follow along. I'll try to keep up on the board with what I'm writing down here. But on page 1 of our notes for skipping to the end, at the very bottom you'll see this question. What are the advantages of knowing how the story will end before you get there? Okay? So I've been like beating this drum about all the disadvantages. Well, there are some significant advantages. If you know how the story is going to end before the end gets here, there are some significant advantages to your life. And the Bible would suggest to your spiritual development, there are advantages to you to know how the story is all going to be resolved, right? Now, I have some suggestions. But before I throw my suggestions out there, if you're on Zoom and you want to unmute yourself, you can do that and throw a couple ideas at me. If you're on the live stream and you want to type a couple of suggestions, I'll have my minions here watching the live stream to see if there's any input that you have. And we're going to try to do this a little bit interactively. Of course, if I had 50, 60 of you in the room like normal, this would be my favorite part because I'd really get to kind of see what you guys are thinking and have you talk to me. But those 2 or 3 of you in the room here, those of you that are on Zoom that can kind of weigh in, those of you on the live stream that want to type something in, here's my question to you. And it's the same question on your sheet there. Okay, we've talked about the disadvantages of knowing the end. What are the advantages to today for you if you know the end of the story before the end of the story gets here? What are the advantages? Anything? Any advantages at all?
Certainly give us confidence.
Okay. Paul said in the back that it can give us confidence. Help me out, Paul. What do you mean by that?
Well, we know what the end is in the sense of what our ultimate future holds.
Okay. But is that necessarily a good thing or a bad thing?
Both.
All right, you're really being you're kind of.
The process of getting to the end.
Yes.
Is rather scary.
Yes, the process of getting to the end is scary.
But ultimately, the end, there is at least hope.
Okay.
That we know where we're going.
Thank you. Okay. All right. I was wondering if you were going to like fill in the blanks there, Aldrich. So hope, right? Because the end of the story, if you believe what the Bible says, is the end of the story a positive thing or a negative thing? It gets to the end. If you read the story on a just a surfacey level, right? Even if you've never read any other page of the Bible, if you start reading in Revelation 21 and 22, and that's all you read, just those last 2 chapters of the story, you will come away saying, you know what? I think this is going to end okay. Like, not even okay, it's going to be good, right? So if you know that that's coming, and what if you're walking, like Paul said, you're walking a part of the journey that's filled with suffering and pain and torment and death. All right, now we're not maybe all the way there, we may be partly there, but there have been Christians throughout the centuries, am I right? That are walking the path of pain and suffering and torment and death and fear and anxiety, right? How important is it for them, and I would say maybe to a lesser degree to us, to know how the story ends? It's huge, right? It's like a 10 out of a 10. You need to know the story ends well. This is why I sometimes, when I'm feeling charitable, cut some slack to that lady I mentioned last week who reads the last chapter of the book, right? Before she reads the first 30 chapters of the book. I give her a little bit of grace sometimes because I realize when it comes to bigger matters in life, not reading a book necessarily, but when it comes to greater matters in life, if I don't know this is going to lead me to a good direction, why would I do it? Like for all of you that have been through chemotherapy, and I am not in that number, and I don't mean to speak lightly about your pain or your situation or your discomfort, but let me just tell you this. If they said to you face to face, and I know some people have had to make this choice, and so I'm not trying to trivialize that, but if they looked at you and said, here's what chemotherapy is going to be, and they lay out all of the things, and losing your hair is the least of your concerns, right, at that point. There's all kinds of physical pain and just exhaustion and just all kinds of stuff. I talk to people all the time who are dealing with the effects of chemo in their bodies, right? We understand the doctor says this is not going to be pleasant. But doctors motivate you to do it anyway. Why? Why do they say you should do it anyway? Because at the end of this treatment, you have a chance, a very good chance, in many of our cases, a very good chance to destroy this disease or at least get rid of it and to live a healthy life, right? That's what motivates you to keep going through the therapy treatments. It's also similar if you get into a car accident and they want you to learn how to walk again. You're like, walk again? Are you kidding me? This is agony. This is pain. Every time I stand up, I can go 2 steps and I got to sit down. I got to rest. Why would I do that? The only reason you would do that is if at the end of the process, there's something good waiting for you, right? This is just common sense how humans are motivated. So God tells us the end from the beginning. And he tells us, and again, I'm painting very broad strokes here. We'll come back and fill in the gaps later. The story ends well for everybody who are a part of God's family. It ends well. Well, that's going to give me a little bit of hope, right? That the story ends well. So I can continue to move forward in my life because I have confidence that this is going to end well. Good. That's one thing. What are some other advantages? Any other advantages to knowing the end of the story before you get there? Yes. Carol said on Zoom that it gives you more of a desire to want to be there at the end, right? If it's a good end, it motivates you to want to be there. So the question becomes then, what do I have to do to get there, right? And so then all of a sudden, all the things that Jesus lays out for you as the life of the follower of Jesus, all of a sudden they make more sense because Jesus is saying to you, oh, this is the way you get ready for that. This is the path that takes you there. And so if you know where the destination is going, all of a sudden you're more motivated to walk the road because you're like, I want to get to the end. I want to have the happy ending, right? I want to be there. Absolutely. Good point. Anybody else? Any other ideas? What are some advantages? All right, that's fine, it's fine. Like I said, if I had all 60 of you in here, I'm sure you'd be barraging me with things right now. Let me just give you some of mine then, okay? And I think, by the way, this is a major one. So there's a just so you know, on page 2, if you're filling these out by hand, and I know we got at least Jess Graves out there doing it for all the rest of us. There's an extra blank down at the end. That's for bonus ones that maybe I hadn't thought of that you guys thought of. So feel free to write in that confidence and hope one because I'm not sure I put it in the other ones here. But let me give you some of my suggestions, okay? And then we'll wrap up for today. And then next week, we're going to dive into some of the earlier parts of the story to help set the context for the end of the story. We'll get to that in a minute, okay? So here we go. And there's a couple of like bullet points here that you can fill in because even though God didn't give us bullet points, I know that if I don't give you bullet points, I'm going to get fired at some point. So here we go. Number 1, not really. It's just a joke. Relax. It's a quarantine joke. They're not supposed to be funny. First one. What is an advantage to knowing how the story ends? I'm going to call it a, number 1, God awareness. Okay? God awareness. If you know how God intends to finish the story, if he tells you ahead of time how the story is going to end, then you have an insight into his heart, right? Let's suppose that this whole thing that we're living is a cosmic joke. It's a joke. It's God telling us there's hope at the end. God telling us you matter. It's God telling us history is moving towards a conclusion, right? And we find out at the end that the whole thing is not true. That there is a God, But there was no point to this entire thing that we've been living. There's no point to it. That all the stuff he told us was misleading to us because he was playing a joke on us. And we come to the end of human history, and either we're not there because when you die, it really is the end, or we get there, and at the end, God changes the deal on us at the last minute, and instead of ruling and reigning with him for eternity, we're his slaves or something worse for all of eternity. Would that give us insight into who God is? Right? So a God who tells stories that have a good ending tells us who God is. It tells us what his heart is all about. And I know I sort of already mentioned this, but I think it's really, really important. We need to know that God is a God who does not play games with us, that he's telling us the truth. And not only is he telling us the truth, but he's telling us that our lives have purpose and our lives have meaning. That your suffering, the love you give to your family, to your neighbors, to your enemies even, matters to the overall story and the overall conclusion of everything. It just makes us aware of who God is. If God is going to lead us off a cliff, then that tells us God is not reliable, right? God is just like the Greek gods. The Greek gods or the Roman gods or whoever. They're fickle. They're changing the rules on us. They get mad at us and they wipe us out. Whatever Greek myth you want to follow, read about the Greek gods, and you see a bunch of mostly human beings who are just more powerful than the rest of us, and we exist to just keep them happy. And when we don't make them happy, they crush us under their boots. If the story ended like that, then we would be we'd probably still serve God, but we'd serve him from a different motivation, wouldn't we? It would be like, oh gosh, I hope I don't make him mad. Because if I make him mad, who knows what place he's going to assign me in eternity. I'll be cleaning toilets for eternity or whatever, I don't know. So the fact that God tells us the end of the story and that the end of the story is good tells us something about the heart of God. And that's important because remember, studying the end times is really about the revelation of God, not just the revelation of what happens. That's number one. Number two, and this is a big one too. This is the last one I think on page 1, is what I'm calling not just God awareness, but self-awareness. Here's what I mean by that. If you know how the story ends, you know where you fit in the story. See what I'm saying? And this is the problem with our human perspective on life. Our human perspective on life is limited by our perspective, right? It's limited by our short lifespan. We jump into the middle of the story, and most of us are going to leave in the middle of the story. And if we're not careful, it's hard to know where we fit. I'm sure if you talk to the people in the Bible stories, they would say the same thing. They're like, I just showed up. I was just born. I didn't ask to be born. Nobody asked me if I wanted to come, if I wanted to be born at this time, to these people. I just showed up and the story was already happening. And the question becomes, what am I supposed to do? How do I fit into the story? How am I supposed to participate with God? If there's a God who's taking human history to this awesome conclusion, how can I be somebody who jumps on board and helps God in that? Or how could I live a life that actually tries to oppose God in all of that? It would be really helpful to know, wouldn't it? What part we're supposed to play in the story. And if you know the end of the story from the beginning, then God can tell you and clue you in to what part you're supposed to play. There are people that think that reality is just about the church. Reality is just about Christians. There was a time, friends, when there were no Christians. Okay? Why? Because Jesus hadn't been born yet. So you couldn't be a Christian because the Christ hadn't come yet. History didn't start when you showed up. History has been here. History will continue long after we're gone. The question is, how do I make my life count today so that I'm playing into the plan God has put in place to get history to the happy ending? That seems to me to be a very important piece. If we didn't know the ending of the story, we don't know where this is going. We could be tempted to think that maybe the whole story was designed to get to us. That maybe we're the pinnacle of the story. Look at how much Jesus did to save us. We must be so valuable. We must be really important. If we don't know how the story ends, to realize that it's really not about exalting one particular group of humans over another group of humans, then we would be probably in danger of having very little self-awareness. And we might exalt ourselves to a place where God doesn't necessarily intend to exalt us. But we also might be tempted to do the opposite. We might be tempted to say, well, I don't really matter that much. Look at this scope of human history. Who knows how many thousands of years of history? And little old me and little old horse heads or little old wherever you live. And what can I do? And who am I? And I don't even know anything. And I'm kind of stupid. Whatever objections you may have, you might have a limited understanding of who you really are in the story. And that's awful. Can you imagine if you get to eternity, you get to Jesus someday in the future, and he looks at you and says, why didn't you try more things for me? Why didn't you live a bigger life? And we could say, well, but we're just this little tiny bit, and the story of the Bible's finished already, and I don't know where this is going, and so I just sort of thought that I wasn't that important. See, but if you study the story, if you know how it's going to end, you understand, I've got a part to play in the story. And it's important and it's significant. It may not be the most significant. It may not all be about me. Fine. But it's still important, and I still have a part to play, and I'm aware of it. See, that's why you need to know the whole story, so you know what you can do. Okay? So first thing is God awareness. Second thing is self-awareness. Flip on to page 2 if you're following along in the notes, page 2. And here's some blanks. And for those of you that like blanks, you're going to be super happy right now because I'm going to give you some blanks to fill in. The third thing that I see, the third advantage, not only do we have self-awareness and God awareness, but we also have this beautiful, beautiful thing. We have time to prepare. Time to prepare. Here's where I'm going to open the scriptures and just share a couple of verses with you. Now, I'm going to come back to this in the morning service, believe it or not, which is kind of a coincidence. I didn't really plan it to be this way, but it sort of worked out this way. Matthew 24 is probably the most detailed description Jesus ever gives about the end times, okay? If you want to know what Jesus thought and what Jesus taught about how the world was going to come to an end, you want to read Matthew 24 and 25. It seems to be kind of like the distillation of the key ideas he had to share while he was in his ministry down here about what was coming at the end. So as a part of that, there's an application that Jesus makes that is really, really important to us. I think to us today as well. Matthew 24, and the verses on there are verses 42 to 44. 42 says this, therefore, Jesus is saying, I'm coming back, basically. And then he says in verse 42, therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. So think about the incredible advantage that Jesus is giving to his disciples in this particular passage. He is telling them, way before the end gets here, how the story is going to end. Because he's like, look, you want to stay awake. You want to be ready. And if you find out what the story is ahead of time and how the story is going to end ahead of time, then you have this huge advantage over everybody else because now you have time to prepare. You have time to get ready for the end, right? Think about this. Suppose you had a graduating class of 100 people and they only told 10 of them that 2 weeks after graduation they'd have to take the SAT for college. 90 people were not told. 10 people were told the SAT was coming on June 22nd. And the SAT, right, is the entrance exam to kind of get you into this idea of thing for college, right? Now, of those 90 people that were not told, some of them are going to do well on the test because guess what? there are smart people out there. There's just smart people out there. You know what? I've never met no, I'm just joking. I've met a few. I've met a few. There's some smart people out there. They're going to do well on a test no matter when it comes, okay? They're just that smart. But you know what? There's a pretty big percentage of that 90 people that are going to be super mad because they're going to get to the day of the test, and guess what? They're not going to have studied any of the ways the test asks questions. They're not going to have studied any of the material, refreshed their memory on what they came up with. They're just going to be there, and they're going to do their best. But you all know the difference between taking a test when you're prepared and taking a test when you're not. Huge difference. Now, the 10 people that were warned ahead of time, now, they may not be the smartest people in the 100. They might not be. But if they've had the chance to prepare for weeks, theoretically, they should do better on the test than the people that didn't have the notice ahead of time. And we can get into testing theory and blah, 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 blah. It's an educational issue that only teachers seemingly care about. But the key thing is, Jesus is saying, look, if you knew that somebody was going to break into your house at 3 a.m., you wouldn't go to sleep and not set your alarm, right? You'd set your alarm at 2:30. You're there with your shotgun at the door, and you're basically saying, don't come into my house, right? You're preparing for it. So Jesus is saying, I'm telling you ahead of time so you can prepare. Now, what that looks like, we got to discuss. But time to prepare is a big deal. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? All right, chapter 25, verses 1 through 12 is a really interesting parable Jesus tells called the parable of the 10 virgins that basically reinforces this exact same point. I'm not going to reteach it. I want you to read it, though. Matthew 25, 1 through 12 afterwards. So that's number 3, time to prepare. Number 4, this is a big one. This is a huge one. This is like a galactically sized one. All right? And maybe I should have made it number 1 if it's that important. But oh well. Here it is. Number 4 is perspective. Perspective. If you know the end of the story before the end gets there, you will have a perspective on your present that most people will not have. Okay? Now, to illustrate what I'm talking about, let me go to the text. And there's at least three. You notice I put 3 references there. 1 Thessalonians 4:13, Romans 8:18, 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18. Those are 3 passages that are just all of them awesome. Just all of them awesome. And they illustrate this point that I'm making, that when you know the end of the story, you know where this story is going, it gives you perspective on your today that if you didn't know where the story was going, you would not be able to have the perspective, okay? Let me just show you what I'm talking about, and hopefully it'll make more sense. Skip ahead to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 14. Or excuse me, verse 13. 1 Thessalonians 4:13. And I love the way Paul would do this. Paul had a practice in a lot of his letters is that he was in dialogue with a lot of churches. What does that mean? In other words, he didn't just send you, here's what you need to believe. He would say, here's some things I want you to believe. And then they would send him back their questions about what he had to say. And sometimes he will respond to those questions in his next letter that he sends to them. It's beautiful. It's teaching 101. It's like you want to know what your students are thinking so you can actually give them the answers they want and need, and not just whatever you think is important in your head, okay? Now, this is what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4:13. He says, but we do not want you to be what? Ignorant. Now, ignorant is an insult only if you're ignorant on purpose, right? We don't insult a 7-year-old because they're ignorant about the human reproductive process, right? We don't hold it against them. Why? They have no experience with it. They've never been there. They don't get it. They're not old enough yet, right? But if you're 47 and you're still ignorant of that process, well, we start to think different things about you, because ignorance is not a bad quality in and of itself as long as you're seeking wisdom. But if you never seek wisdom and you hold on to ignorance, right, then by the end of your life in many ways is wasted. Well, Paul says, I don't want you to be ignorant. And my version actually translates the word uninformed, right? Which is another way of saying ignorant. I don't want you to be uninformed. Listen to this. brothers, about those who are asleep. Now, who are those who are asleep? The text makes it pretty clear a little bit later that people who are asleep, asleep was a New Testament way of describing physical death, okay? And obviously the correlations are pretty obvious, right? When somebody closes their eyes in death, they resemble, at least from a distance, someone who's asleep, okay? And so Christians who knew that death was not the end of the story for any of us started to describe physical death as asleep or being asleep. So Paul says, look, I don't want you to be ignorant or uninformed about people who are asleep. Listen to this. That you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. You see what I'm saying here? He's like, look, guys, if you don't understand what happens to people when they die, when they know Jesus Christ, if you don't understand what happens, if you think that that's the end, which is what the dominant theory is in the world today, if you think death is the end of the story, you are going to grieve for that person in a certain way, aren't you? I've heard stories, people at the funeral grabbing onto caskets, not wanting to let the person go, not weeping, and just their lives fall apart. If death is the end, then grieving without hope just makes sense. But Paul says, hey, you Christians, love ya. That ought not to be you. You should not be at the graveside shedding tears that are hopeless tears. You ought to be informed so that you can grieve differently. Now, here's what I love. Paul doesn't say you shouldn't grieve. He just says you shouldn't grieve like people who have no hope. Two different kinds of grieving. It's not choosing between grieving and not grieving. It's choosing between grieving with hope and grieving without hope. And Paul says, listen, I've got some stuff to tell you about the end of the story. That if you know this, you're informed about this, you will not become one of these people who grieves without hope. Why? Because you have perspective. For goodness sake, you're calling it asleep. That means a Christian understands that the closing of the eyes in death is not the end of the story, that there is a moment when that asleep person, that dead person, will once again awake. But you won't know that if God didn't tell you the end of the story. So if God tells you the end of the story, that that's the way it turns out, then you can grieve still, yes, but you grieve as people with hope. And it changes your perspective. All of a sudden, this thing, putting this body in the ground or in the crypt or wherever you put it, it's different. It's not that it's not painful. It's not that it doesn't rip your soul apart in different ways. But it means I don't have to say goodbye forever. And to me, that makes a huge difference. Huge difference. If I had to leave my family for 5 years to go on some kind of tour of duty, if I joined the military, it would rip my heart into teeny tiny little pieces. I would be an absolute mess. But if I knew that at the end of that 5 years, I was going to live long enough and I was going to see them again, it would be very different than if I were saying goodbye to them knowing I would never see them again. It's just different. It doesn't mean that it's easier necessarily. It's just different. And so Paul wants us to have perspective. Now, that's one example. And that's how do I grieve over people who have died. And now these people who have died are people who know Jesus, okay? Now, the second example is from Romans 8:18. And I know I talked about this in my sermon last week, which it's always dangerous to assume people remember your sermon from last week, but I think I did mention it. Romans 8:18 says this, that sneeze is coming, just so you know. I'm warning you again. I'm hoping I can make it to 10:30, but I'm not sure I can. Thank you, Paul. That's good. Verse 18 says this. Of Romans 8. Romans 8:18 is where we are. Paul says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. Did you catch that? He's comparing two things. Present suffering with coming glory. Present suffering, coming glory. Which is happening right now? Present suffering, right? What hasn't happened yet? The coming glory. And yet, he says, I consider I'm doing the mental math in my head that the present suffering is nothing compared to how great the coming glory will be. Well, how in the world can you do that mental math, Paul? Because God told him the end of the story, right? He already has that data, and that data gives him perspective on his present suffering. Does it make it any easier? Well, yeah, it probably does make it a little bit easier. Does it take away all the pain and all the agony and all the hurt? No, but it gives you perspective on it. All of a sudden you realize this is not the end. I wasn't destined for eternal suffering. I'm destined for amazing glory. And this temporary suffering is just that. It's temporary. Now, 2 Corinthians 4 basically says the exact same thing. You know, the present suffering, it can't be compared to the glory that's to come. Read it. It's beautiful. The verses will bless your heart on a Mother's Day. By the way, happy Mother's Day to all of you moms out there. Good to sort of see you and wish you happy mother things. Although a lot of you are in trouble because your husbands can't take you out to lunch today, or most of you can't. So hopefully they got other plans. But we'll see how it works out. We'll see how it works out for you. I know my wife is incredibly gracious to all of us in how we're trying to celebrate her today. But anyway, that's another story for another time. I won't go to 2 Corinthians 4, but you understand the point, perspective. Okay, let's keep going here. I love this. This next one is really cool too. And there's two parts to this same one, but I think they're kind of synonyms of each other, so I wanted to put them both in there. Not only do we have perspective, okay, but we also have what I'm calling determination and focus. Determination and focus. Okay? When you know the end of the story and how this is going to be resolved, it gives you, in my mind, a sense of grit to deal with the present because I know where I'm going to get there. If you talk to athletes who have a struggle against another athlete over the victory of an athletic contest of some kind, whether it's a race, whether it's a basketball game, whether it's playing chess, whatever the case may be, whenever there's a struggle between two wills, you know that if you are confident you're going to win, if you know somehow that you're going to win, it gives you energy to play. It gives you energy to compete. It gives you energy to fight. Now, that's not the only way you can be motivated as an athlete, but if you know you're going to win, it gives you a confidence that helps you to keep going. Let me just show you one example of this. 1 John chapter 3. 1 John chapter 3, because I think hopefully this isn't going to be strange or a brand new thought for you. But 1 John chapter 3, verses 1, 2, and 3, okay? So 1 John 3, 1, 2, and 3. He says this, "See what kind of love the Father has given to us." What kind of love has the Father given to us? Oh, I'll tell you. You are called the children of God, and so we are. He loves you so much, he's adopted you into his family. This is crazy talk. Crazy talk. Never should have happened. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know him. In other words, we're more like God now than we're like the world, even though we still sometimes act like the world. Verse 2, "Beloved, we are God's children now," and check this out, "and what we will be has not yet appeared." So John is acknowledging, hey, I'm a child of God now, but I am not the child of God I'm going to be. If you examine my life and my heart, you examine my flaws and my faults, what you'll discover is I fall short of the description of what a child of God is supposed to look like. Any of us can look in the mirror and say, I am not who I'm supposed to be. And John acknowledges that. What we're going to be hasn't yet appeared to us. But look at what he says. "But we know that when he appears," now that's in the future, when he appears, when he comes, the end of the story, "we shall be like him because we shall see him as he is." That's the piece of information. That's how the story ends. I can encourage you that you will be just like Jesus when you see him face to face. There will be some transformation that comes over you. And that moment when you see him face to face, something will change inside of you and you will 100% reflect in your personality and your character who Jesus Christ is. Okay? That's the news that God wants you to know. To give you perspective, but then it goes beyond that. Look at verse 3. "And everyone who hopes in him purifies himself as he is pure." What is the reasoning there? John is saying this. If you know that when you see Jesus face to face, you're going to be exactly like Jesus, then what does that do to you right now? It motivates you to be as much like Jesus today as I possibly can be. If someday I'm going to be like Jesus, then I am going to right now, in the middle of my struggle, I'm going to purify myself. I'm going to fight against sin. I'm going to get rid of all these things that are holding me back, right? Because I know I'm going to get there someday, right? If somebody said to you, it's pointless, you're never going to be like Jesus, why would you try? Why would you try today to act like him if you know that you're never going to get there? John says you're going to get there. And that hope purifies you, and it helps you to fight in the battle. It gives you determination, and it gives you focus. 2 Peter 3 basically says the exact same thing, so look it up. One last advantage that I want to share with you, and this is the obvious one, right? And it's peace. Peace of mind, right? What's the scariest thing about life? That we don't know what's happening to us next. Some people can talk about how it's a wonderful adventure when you don't know what's going to happen, blah, blah, blah. They're all lying. We all want to know that something good is on the other side of the rainbow. We want to know that around the corner something good is waiting for us, and we're all scared to some extent that something bad is waiting for us around the corner. So if God tells us the end of the story, and if the end of the story is good, then what can that do for us? It can help us have peace. Peace. Because peace comes from knowing that I'm safe in the hands of God, that even if I have a difficult journey to walk, the end of the journey is worth it. So I think there's a lot of advantages. A lot of advantages. What we'll do next time is we'll wrap up with these conclusions here, so kind of sum it all up, because I do that anyway, so that way you won't have to waste any time with me double summing it up. I'm going to sum it up next week, and then we're going to launch into a look at some of what the early part of the story has to say about how the story ends the way it ends, okay? Love ya. See you in the service in a few minutes. Bye-bye.